Most people might assume the children of notorious criminals would want nothing to do with their parents' dark legacy. They'd choose legitimate careers, distance themselves from the violence, maybe even change their names. After all, only few would willingly step into a world of constant danger, federal investigations, and the possibility of spending life behind bars. But history tells a different story. These sons weren't just born into wealth. They were born into a world of absolute power. They were taught to see violence as management, betrayal as a strategic necessity, and their last name as both ultimate authority and a permanent target. In many cases, the sons didn't just follow in their father's footsteps, they outdid them. In this video, we look at the profiles of the most ruthless sons of mob bosses and how their unique upbringing changed their view on the world, the weight of their infamous name, and the actions they took to secure their own power. You'll hear exactly how they operated, their methods for taking control, their often more efficient approach to crime, and the dark reality that in their world, the ultimate act of loyalty often required becoming even more ruthless than then. Generation before. In this video, like father, like son stops being a cliché and starts becoming a warning. Section 1. Nicky Scarfo Jr. Nicodemo Salvatore Scarfo Jr., also called Nicky Scarfo Jr., or Mr. Apple, was the son of Nicky Scarfo Sr., better known as Little Nicky. Born on June 9, 1965, in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Nicky Jr. never had a chance at a normal life. His father was arguably the most violent mob boss in Philadelphia history, a 5'5" psychopath who turned the Philadelphia crime family into a killing machine during the 1980s. While most mob boss sons inherit wealth and influence, Nicky Jr. inherited something far more dangerous. A legacy of violence, paranoia, and a last name that carried weight in the underworld, but also placed a permanent target on his back. His story spans a lifetime of criminal activity that included 2 separate federal convictions and ultimately a 30-year prison sentence that will likely see him die behind bars. The relationship between Little Nicky and his son was complicated. Little Nicky was a violent sociopath who became boss of the Philadelphia crime family in 1981, just as his son was entering his teenage years. Growing up in the Scarfo household meant witnessing firsthand the mechanics of organized crime. Nicky Jr. didn't learn about the mafia from movies or street corner gossip. He learned it at the dinner table, where his father discussed murders with the same casual tone other fathers used to discuss their workday. In 1983, when Nicky Jr. was just 18 years old, he was formally introduced into the Philadelphia crime family. For Nicky Jr., it sealed his fate. Once you take the oath, there is no walking away. The mafia becomes your life and your identity. The years following Nicky Jr.'s induction into the Philadelphia mob were characterized by escalating violence and increasing federal scrutiny. Throughout the mid-1980s, as his father's regime grew more brutal and unstable, Nicky Jr. worked his way through the organization's ranks. He started as a low-level soldier, collecting gambling debts and running small-scale extortion schemes. The work was dirty and dangerous, involving late-night collections from people who couldn't pay, delivering beatings to those who showed disrespect, and maintaining the climate of fear that kept his father's empire functioning. Law enforcement officials from this period describe young Nicky as ambitious and ruthless, though lacking the pure psychotic edge that made his father so terrifying. Where Little Nicky would kill over a perceived slight or a moment of disrespect, Nicky Jr. was more calculating, more willing to use violence as a tool rather than an expression of rage. Being the son of Philadelphia's most feared mob boss made Nicky Jr. a target not just for law enforcement, but for rival factions within the criminal underworld. On October 31, 1989, Nicky Jr. dined at an Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia, the same establishment that would later become a focal point of FBI surveillance. As he sat at a table near the front of the restaurant, A man wearing a Batman mask and holding a plastic Halloween candy bag entered the restaurant and approached Scarfo's table. The man pulled a machine pistol from the bag and fired at Scarfo. He was struck 8 times in the neck, arms, and torso, but no vital organs were hit. Nicky Jr. survived the attack, and the assassination attempt had a clear effect on Nicky Jr. It reinforced what he already knew. In the mob, you could trust no one completely, not even members of your own organization. He had been tested by violence and had survived. He had been shot multiple times and lived to tell about it. In the twisted logic of the mafia, this made him more credible, more dangerous, more worthy of respect. But the shooting also created complications that would follow him for years. The FBI, already building their case against the Scarfo organization, now had yet another unsolved mob shooting to investigate. The incident drew even more attention to the family at a time when they could least afford it. By the late 1980s, the FBI had made dismantling the Philadelphia mob a top priority. Special Agent Louis Freeh, who would later become FBI director, led the investigation into Little Nicky's organization. The Bureau carried out advanced surveillance techniques, acquired informants within the family, and built a comprehensive case that documented years of criminal activity. The violence had become so excessive that even other mafia families were concerned. The Commission, the governing body of New York's 5 families, had traditionally allowed Philadelphia to operate with minimal oversight. But the body count under Little Nicky's leadership was drawing unwanted attention to organized crime nationwide. In January 1987, Little Nicky was indicted on multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and operating a criminal enterprise. This detailed a decade of violence and corruption, naming Little Nicky as the architect of numerous murders and the boss of a criminal organization that had terrorized Philadelphia and South Jersey. On November 19, 1988, Judge Franklin Van Antwerpen sentenced him to 55 years in federal prison. At 60 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. Little Nicky was led away in chains, ending one of the bloodiest reigns in American mafia history. The conviction created a crisis for Nicky Jr., then 23 years old. His father was gone, imprisoned in a maximum security facility where he would spend the rest of his life. The Philadelphia family was in chaos, with various factions vying for control, and the FBI continuing to pressure the organization. Nicky Jr. faced a critical choice. He could try to maintain his position within the decimated organization, potentially rising to a leadership role as his father's legacy gave him credibility with older members. Or he could walk away, leave Philadelphia, and try to build a life outside the mob. With his father in federal prison serving a life sentence, Nicky Jr. started building his own criminal empire throughout the 1990s. Unlike his father, who had relied on traditional mafia activities like murder, extortion, and brutal enforcement, Nicky Jr. recognized that the law enforcement landscape had changed. The FBI had become sophisticated in its surveillance techniques, and the willingness of mobsters to become cooperating witnesses had shattered the once sacred code of omerta. He needed to find criminal activities that generated income without the extreme violence that had destroyed his father's organization. He found his answer in illegal gambling, an area where he could use his family connections and reputation while avoiding the constant bloodshed that drew federal attention. By the mid-1990s, Scarfo Jr. had established one of the most sophisticated illegal gambling operations on the East Coast. His empire generated millions every year. He ran sports betting establishments where customers could place bets on football, basketball, baseball, and other sporting events. The operation used a central phone bank where trained operators took bets, calculated odds, and managed the flow of money. Bettors could call from anywhere in the tri-state area, place their bets, and either pay up when they lost or collect their winnings through a network of runners who operated throughout Philadelphia and South Jersey. The phone bank operation alone generated an estimated $3 to $5 million every year in pure profit, after paying winners and covering operational costs. Beyond sports betting, Scarfo Jr. controlled the placement of video poker machines in bars, restaurants, and social clubs throughout the region. These machines were illegal, but making them so much money. Each machine could generate several $1,000s per week, with Scarfo Jr. taking a percentage of the profits. He had arrangements with hundreds of establishments, providing the machines, servicing them regularly, and collecting the cash. The operation required organization and discipline. He employed technicians to maintain the machines, collectors to retrieve the money, and enforcers to ensure that bar owners didn't try to skim profits or install machines from competing operators. The video poker operation was estimated to generate another $2 to $3 million annually. Alongside his gambling operations was an extensive loan sharking network that targeted compulsive gamblers who had lost more than they could afford to pay. When someone accumulated gambling debts they couldn't cover, Scarfo Jr.'s organization would offer them loans with huge interest rates, typically 2 to 3% per week, which translated to annual interest rates exceeding 200%. The loans came with a threat. If you didn't pay, violence would follow. Borrowers who fell behind on payments were bound to experience escalating intimidation. First came threatening phone calls, then visits to their homes or workplaces, then beatings. In extreme cases, Scarfo Jr.'s enforcers would take over the debtor's business or force them to commit crimes to generate money to repay the debt. In 1999, at age 34, Nicky Jr. was officially recognized as the underboss, or the second-in-command of the Philadelphia crime family, second in command to boss Joseph "Skinny Joey" Merlino. The FBI had been monitoring Scarfo Jr.'s activities for years through Operation Flatiron, an extensive investigation that used wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperating witnesses to build a detailed case against the Philadelphia mob's leadership. Agents had installed listening devices in locations where Scarfo Jr. conducted business, including Dante and Luigi's restaurant in South Philadelphia, a popular meeting spot for mobsters. The wiretaps captured hundreds of hours of conversations where Scarfo Jr. discussed gambling operations, threatened violence against those who owed money, and coordinated his criminal activities with associates. The FBI also had surveillance footage showing Scarfo Jr. meeting with known criminals, collecting money, and clearly functioning as a leader within the organization. One particular piece of evidence showed him counting large amounts of cash at a social club, money that investigators could trace back to illegal gambling proceeds. Additionally, several low-level associates facing their own criminal charges had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors, providing insider testimony about how Scarfo Jr.'s operations functioned. These cooperating witnesses described the structure of the gambling empire, identified the various players involved, and detailed specific criminal acts they had witnessed or participated in under Scarfo Jr.'s direction. The evidence accumulated over years of investigation was overwhelming and undeniable. On November 4, 1999, FBI agents arrested Nicky Scarfo Jr. at his South Jersey home. The arrest was part of a coordinated sweep that netted 23 other Philadelphia mob members and associates, representing the largest blow to the organization since his father's conviction 11 years earlier. Scarfo Jr. was charged with racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. The indictment detailed his 15-year criminal career and identified him as a leader in the Philadelphia crime family, who had generated millions of dollars through illegal activities. Federal prosecutors set bail at $5 million, an amount designed to keep him incarcerated while awaiting trial. The federal case against Nicky Scarfo Jr. was the culmination of years of investigative work by the FBI's Philadelphia office. Operation Flatiron had begun in the mid-1990s, as agents recognized that despite the imprisonment of little Nicky, his son was building a new criminal empire that, while less violent than his father's, was potentially more profitable and sustainable. The investigation employed every tool in the modern law enforcement arsenal, from traditional surveillance to cutting-edge electronic eavesdropping. FBI agents established observation posts near locations where Scarfo Jr. conducted business, photographing everyone who came and went, documenting patterns of activity, and building a comprehensive picture of his criminal network. They identified the key players in his organization, from high-level associates who helped manage operations to low-level runners who collected gambling debts and serviced video poker machines. The wiretap evidence proved particularly devastating. Federal judges had authorized the interception of phone calls to numbers associated with Scarfo Jr.'s gambling operations, and the recordings captured detailed discussions of illegal activity. In one conversation, Scarfo Jr. discussed the weekly take from video poker machines, calculating profits and deciding how much money to distribute to various associates. In another, he threatened a gambler who owed $50,000, saying the man would need to be taught a lesson if payment wasn't received within 48 hours. Several gamblers who had been victimized by Scarfo Jr.'s loan sharking operation agreed to testify about how they had been threatened and extorted. Bar owners who had hosted his video poker machines described how they were forced to participate in the scheme under threat of violence or property damage. Most significantly, some made members of the Philadelphia family who were facing long prison sentences decided that the old code of silence was worth breaking if it meant reducing their own time behind bars. These cooperators provided invaluable insider information about how the organization functioned, who reported to whom, and how money flowed from street-level operations up through the hierarchy to leaders like Scarfo Jr. The trial of Nicky Scarfo Jr. and his co-defendants began in 2001 in federal court in Philadelphia, and was prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, which had made dismantling the Philadelphia mob a top priority. The jury had been selected carefully, with both sides exercising their challenges to eliminate potential jurors who seemed biased either for or against organized crime defendants. The prosecution's strategy was to overwhelm the jury with evidence from multiple sources, each reinforcing the others to create an irrefutable picture of criminal activity. They began with FBI agents who testified about the surveillance operations, explaining how they had monitored Scarfo Jr.'s activities for years and what they had observed. Special agent testimony established the foundation of the case, showing that Scarfo Jr. was a central figure in an ongoing criminal enterprise. Then came the wiretap evidence, with jurors listening to hours of recorded conversations where Scarfo Jr. discussed illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. The prosecution played these recordings in court, providing transcripts so jurors could follow along, and then called expert witnesses to explain the coded language and put the conversations in context. The effect was powerful. Hearing Scarfo Jr.'s own voice discussing criminal activities made the crimes feel immediate and undeniable. The most dramatic moments came when cooperating witnesses took the stand. Philip Leonetti, the former underboss who had worked closely with both Little Nicky and Nicky Jr., provided devastating testimony about the Scarfo family's criminal operations. Leonetti had participated in numerous murders during his time in the mob and had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation with federal authorities. He described how Nicky Jr. had been groomed from childhood to enter the family business, how he had participated in various criminal schemes, and how he had used his father's reputation to intimidate victims and rivals. The defense attacked Leonetti's credibility, pointing out that he was an admitted murderer who had received favorable treatment for testifying. They argued that cooperators like Leonetti would say anything prosecutors wanted in order to reduce their own sentences, making their testimony inherently unreliable. But Leonetti remained calm under the circumstances, acknowledging his past crimes while insisting that he was now telling the truth about Scarfo Jr.'s activities. The defense tried to poke holes in individual pieces of evidence, suggesting that some conversations were unclear or that some witnesses had other motives for testifying. They argued that being the son of a notorious mobster didn't automatically make Nicky Jr. guilty of the charges, and that the government was persecuting him because of his last name, rather than because of solid evidence. But the evidence was simply too strong to overcome. After weeks of testimony and mountains of documented criminal activity, the jury began deliberations on July 14, 2001. 6 days later, on July 20, 2001, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on multiple counts of racketeering, illegal gambling, and loan sharking. Scarfo Jr. was acquitted of the conspiracy to commit murder charges, as the evidence for those counts had been less concrete than the gambling and extortion evidence. The verdict represented a major victory for federal prosecutors and a devastating blow to what remained of the Philadelphia mob. Joseph Merlino was also convicted, though on fewer charges, while several co-defendants were acquitted entirely, demonstrating that the jury had carefully considered the evidence rather than simply convicting everyone associated with organized crime. On January 17, 2002, Nicky Scarfo Jr. appeared before Judge Herbert J. Hutton for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with law enforcement officials, victims, journalists, and family members on both sides. Federal prosecutors argued for a harsh sentence, presenting victim impact statements from people whose lives had been destroyed by Scarfo Jr.'s criminal activities. One gambler described how he had lost his family, his home, and nearly his life after accumulating debts with Scarfo Jr.'s operation and being subjected to escalating threats and violence. A bar owner testified about being forced to host illegal video poker machines and living in constant fear that refusing would result in his business being burned down or worse. The defense argued for leniency, noting that Scarfo Jr. had no prior federal convictions and that he had been acquitted of the most serious charges involving murder conspiracies. His attorneys presented a different narrative, portraying him as someone who had been born into circumstances beyond his control, raised in an environment where organized crime was normalized, and never given a real chance to choose a different path. Judge Hutton listened to all the arguments before delivering his sentence. He acknowledged that Scarfo Jr. had indeed been born into difficult circumstances, but emphasized that at some point, every person must take responsibility for their own choices. The judge sentenced Nicky Scarfo Jr. to 33 months in federal prison and ordered him to pay $18,000 in fines. The sentence surprised many legal observers who had expected a much harsher punishment given the severity of the crimes and the defendant's leadership role in the organization. The light sentence reflected federal sentencing guidelines at the time, which took into account that Scarfo Jr. had no prior federal convictions and had been acquitted of the violent crime charges. Judge Hutton noted that while Scarfo Jr. was clearly involved in organized crime, the evidence showed he was primarily a white-collar criminal who ran gambling and loan sharking operations rather than a violent enforcer. Scarfo Jr. was sent to a federal prison camp at Fort Dix, New Jersey, a relatively low-security facility where he served his time quietly, avoiding the violence and drama that characterized many organized crime defendants' incarcerations. He was released in 2004 after serving approximately 28 months, including time off for good behavior. The sentence seemed like a reprieve, a second chance to walk away from the violent life and build something legitimate. But for someone like Nicky Scarfo Jr., who had spent his entire adult life in organized crime, going straight was easier said than done. After his release from federal prison in 2004, Nicky Scarfo Jr. was supposed to rebuild his life as a law-abiding citizen. He was on supervised release with strict conditions, regular meetings with a probation officer, prohibitions against associating with known criminals, and requirements to maintain legitimate employment. For a brief period, it appeared he might actually comply. He got a job in the construction industry and kept a low profile. But within a year, Scarfo Jr. was back in the criminal world, this time orchestrating an elaborate mortgage fraud scheme that would ultimately lead to his final downfall. Between 2007 and 2011, he defrauded banks and mortgage lenders out of approximately $12 million through a sophisticated operation involving straw buyers, corrupt appraisers, and falsified loan applications. The scheme was perfectly timed to exploit the chaos of the 2008 financial crisis, when banks were desperate to make loans and oversight was lax. But the FBI was watching, and on May 23, 2011, agents arrested him for the second time, charging him with wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of decades in prison if convicted at trial, Scarfo Jr. pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud on January 13, 2015. Judge Joel Schneider sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay over $4 million in restitution to the victimized financial institutions. At 50 years old, Scarfo Jr. wouldn't be eligible for release until approximately 2040, when he would be 75 years old. He is currently incarcerated in a federal prison, where he has served approximately 10 years of his sentence as of 2025. His father, Little Nicky, died in federal prison on January 13, 2017, at age 87, having served 28 years of his 55-year sentence. The Scarfo dynasty, built on violence and sustained through fear, ended not with dramatic mob hits, but with one generation finally deciding that the cost of the life was simply too high to pay. Nicky Jr.'s attempt to escape his father's reputation led him to prison, but this next person's effort to escape the life of crime led him into a war that nearly destroyed his family. Section 2. Salvatore Bonanno. Salvatore Vincent Bonanno, known throughout his life as Bill, was born on November 5, 1932, in Brooklyn, New York, into the closest thing organized crime had to royalty. His father, Joseph Bonanno, better known as Joe Bananas, was one of the founding architects of the American Mafia's modern structure, a member of the original commission that divided New York into 5 criminal territories in the 1930s. Unlike mob sons who could operate in the shadows, Bill was thrust into the spotlight from childhood, groomed explicitly to take over a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Over 4 decades of mob warfare, multiple federal convictions, and ultimately a transformation that saw him become one of the first high-ranking mobsters to publicly discuss La Cosa Nostra, the Mafia, in detailed memoirs. Bill Bonanno's criminal career resulted in approximately 15 years in federal prison across multiple sentences, made him a target of countless assassination attempts during the bloody Banana War that nearly destroyed his father's organization, and positioned him as a bridge between the old-world mafia that his father built and the modern era. The relationship between Joe Bonanno and his son Bill was defined by impossible expectations and the weight of a criminal legacy that stretched back to Sicily. Joe Bonanno had immigrated to America as a young man and risen through the ranks of organized crime to become one of the most powerful bosses in the country by the 1930s. He controlled the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's 5 families, with territories spanning from Brooklyn to Arizona to Canada. The empire generated huge sums of money through labor racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, narcotics trafficking, and control of legitimate businesses including funeral homes, bakeries, and cattle ranches. Joe Bonanno was old-world Sicilian in every sense. He valued honor, respect, tradition, and the code of silence above all else. He ruled his family with strategic brilliance rather than raw violence, preferring to outsmart rivals rather than simply kill them, though he was perfectly willing to order murders when necessary. Bill attended private schools in Arizona, where his father maintained extensive legitimate business interests, including cattle ranches and cheese factories. Joe Bonanno insisted his son receive a proper education, enrolling him at the University of Arizona to study agriculture. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Bill might pursue a legitimate path, managing his father's legal enterprises rather than the criminal empire. That possibility disappeared when Bill married Rosalie Profaci in 1956. Rosalie was the niece of Joseph Profaci, boss of another one of New York's 5 families. The marriage was a strategic alliance between 2 of the most powerful mafia families in America, creating a bond that would prove important during the violent conflicts to come. Shortly after his marriage, Bill was formally introduced into the Bonanno crime family. Joe Bonanno didn't make his son just another soldier. He positioned Bill as his heir apparent, his consigliere, his most trusted advisor. This decision created immediate resentment among older, more experienced members of the organization, who had spent decades working their way up the ranks only to see the boss's son leap over them based solely on bloodline. But no one dared challenge Joe Bonanno's decision directly. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, Bill worked closely with his father, learning the intricacies of running a major criminal organization. He served as Joe's representative in meetings with other families, delivered orders to captains and soldiers, helped resolve internal disputes, and oversaw various criminal operations. The FBI, which had been monitoring the Bonanno family since the 1950s, noted that Bill was intelligent, well-spoken, and sophisticated. More businessman than thug, which made him potentially more dangerous. The crisis that would define Bill Bonanno's life and nearly destroy him began building in the early 1960s as tensions escalated between Joe Bonanno and the other families on the commission. Joe had always been ambitious, but by 1963, other bosses believed he was planning something unforgivable: the assassination of several commission members to seize control of their territories. Carlo Gambino, boss of the Gambino family, and Thomas Lucchese, boss of the Lucchese family, became convinced that Joe Bonanno was plotting to kill them and take over their operations. They summoned Joe Bonanno to appear before them to answer questions about his alleged plot. Joe refused the summons, an act of disrespect and defiance that violated the commission's authority. On October 21, 1964, the situation exploded. Joe Bonanno was kidnapped off the streets of Manhattan by members of his own organization acting on orders from the commission. He disappeared completely, and for nearly 2 years, no one knew whether he was alive or dead. The disappearance created immediate chaos within the Bonanno family. Bill Bonanno suddenly found himself trying to hold together an organization being torn apart by internal factions and external pressure from the other families. The commission appointed Gaspar Di Gregorio as the new boss of the Bonanno family, expecting the organization to accept the change and move forward. But a significant faction of the family remained loyal to Joe Bonanno and refused to recognize Di Gregorio's authority. Bill led this faction, positioning himself as his father's representative and the legitimate heir to leadership. The Bonanno family split into two. Di Gregorio's faction wanted to make peace with the commission and accept the new leadership structure. Bill's faction refused to surrender what they saw as their rightful control of the family. What followed became known as the Bonanno War, named mockingly by the press after Joe Bonanno's nickname, Joe Bananas. The conflict would last for years and result in dozens of murders as the two factions fought for control. Bill operated from various safe houses throughout Brooklyn and Queens, constantly moving to avoid assassination attempts. He met with his men in restaurants, cars, and private homes, always armed, always watching for betrayal. The FBI increased surveillance on both factions, documenting meetings, recording conversations, and building cases against everyone involved. By early 1966, both factions were losing members to arrests and violence. The commission was pressuring Di Gregorio to resolve the situation permanently by eliminating Bill and his top associates. Bill knew that a final confrontation was coming. He just didn't know when or where. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same location 2 nights in a row, varying his routes, and trusting only a small inner circle of loyalists who had proven themselves completely committed to his father's legacy. On January 28, 1966, Bill Bonanno came within seconds of being murdered in what would become one of the most infamous botched hits in mafia history. Bill received word through intermediaries that Gaspar Di Gregorio wanted to arrange a peace meeting. The location would be a house at Troutman Street in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn. Di Gregorio's message claimed he was tired of the bloodshed and wanted to find a resolution that would end the war and allow both factions to exist together. Bill was doubtful. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and those instincts told him this could be a trap. But he also recognized that the war could not go on any longer. His faction was running out of money and manpower. If there was even a chance for genuine peace, he had to consider it. Bill took precautions. He brought several of his most trusted associates, including Frank Mari, Carl Samari, and Peter Notaro. All were armed and prepared for trouble. They drove to the Troutman Street location in 2 cars, arriving around 11 p.m. on a cold January night. The street was dark and mostly deserted. The house looked empty. No lights were visible. No one came out to greet them. Bill told his driver to slow down, but not stop. That decision saved his life. As the car drove past the house, the front door burst open and gunmen appeared in the doorway and windows. They opened fire with shotguns and rifles, unleashing a barrage of lead at the vehicles. Shell casings littered the street. Shotgun pellets and rifle rounds tore through the cars, but incredibly and miraculously, no one was hit. The assassination attempt was clearly incompetent. Despite firing at close range with multiple weapons and having the element of surprise, the shooters had failed to kill or even wound any of their targets. Police later recovered dozens of shell casings from the scene and found bullet holes in nearby buildings and parked cars. The hit had all the signs of professional mob work: the lure to a specific location, the coordinated ambush, the multiple shooters. But the execution was poorly organized. Whatever the reason, Bill Bonanno drove away from Troutman Street unharmed, but fully aware that the war had escalated to a point of no return. The Troutman Street ambush made national headlines. The New York Times ran a front-page story about the attempted mob hit. Television news programs covered it extensively. The FBI, which had been monitoring both factions of the Bonanno family, now had public evidence of the internal war. The botched hit embarrassed everyone involved. DeGregorio's faction looked incompetent for failing to kill their targets at close range. Bill's faction looked vulnerable for walking into an obvious trap. The commission was furious that the conflict had become such a public spectacle. The attempted murder changed the dynamics of the war in several ways. First, it eliminated any possibility of genuine peace between the factions. Bill now knew with absolute certainty that DeGregorio and his associates wanted him dead and would try again. Second, it intensified law enforcement investigations to unbearable levels. The FBI launched a massive investigation into both factions, installing additional wiretaps, increasing surveillance teams, and pressuring family members and associates to cooperate. Third, it showed Bill's loyalists that their leader was marked for death and that staying with him meant accepting the same risk. The violence continued for even longer. Bodies started turning up across Brooklyn and Queens. Frank Mari, one of Bill's top associates, who had been in the car during the Troutman Street ambush, was shot to death outside his home in September 1966. Sam Perrone, a DeGregorio loyalist, disappeared and was later found dead in a vacant lot. The murders were professional and brutal. Multiple gunshots to the head, execution-style killings designed to send messages. Bill survived multiple additional attempts on his life during this period. His car was shot at while he drove through Brooklyn. Gunmen staked out his home. He received death threats through messengers. In May 1966, Joe Bonanno suddenly reappeared after nearly 20 months in hiding. His return should have ended the conflict, but instead it complicated everything. The commission refused to recognize Joe's authority to reclaim leadership of his family. Joe refused to accept DeGregorio as the legitimate boss. The standoff continued, with Bill caught in the middle, trying to support his father while keeping his faction together and staying alive. The FBI's investigation into Bill Bonanno and the Banana War had actually begun years before the Troutman Street ambush. But that failed hit provided the evidence for an all-out assault on what remained of the Bonanno family. The Bureau had been conducting surveillance on organized crime families since the 1950s, installing wiretaps on phones, bugging meeting locations, and photographing associates. By 1966, they had accumulated thousands of hours of recorded conversations and hundreds of surveillance photographs documenting Bonanno family activities. The investigation into Bill specifically focused on his role as his father's representative and his leadership of the Loyalist faction during the war. FBI agents documented every meeting Bill attended, every associate he spoke with, and every move he made across Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. The evidence against Bill fell into several categories. First, there were the wiretapped phone conversations, where Bill discussed family business using coded language that prosecutors could decode for juries. He talked about that thing, and our friends, and taking care of problems, phrases that meant nothing to civilians but had clear meanings within organized crime. Second, there was testimony from FBI agents who had conducted physical surveillance, watching Bill meet with known criminals, observing him at locations associated with mob activity, and documenting his movements during the period of the Banana War. Third, there were financial records showing that Bill lived far beyond what his claimed legitimate income as a cheese salesman could support. He owned a home in an expensive Long Island neighborhood, drove luxury cars, and spent money freely despite having no visible means of legitimate employment that would generate such wealth. There were also cooperating witnesses from within the Bonanno family itself. Several lower-level members facing their own criminal charges agreed to provide information to federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. These cooperators described the structure of the family, Bill's position within it, and specific criminal activities they had witnessed or participated in under Bill's direction. They testified about gambling operations, loan sharking schemes, and extortion rackets that Bill had overseen. They described meetings where strategy for the war was discussed and where Bill gave orders to his faction. While none of the cooperators could directly testify to Bill committing violent crimes because he was careful never to get his hands dirty with actual murders or beatings, they gave a clear picture of him as a leader in a criminal organization. The investigation ended on May 17, 1966, when federal agents arrested Bill Bonanno along with several other family members. The charges were conspiracy and obstruction of justice related to the ongoing investigation into organized crime and the Banana War. The obstruction charges came from incidents where witnesses who had been summoned to testify before grand juries suddenly refused to cooperate, or claimed not to remember crucial details after being visited by Bonanno associates. While they couldn't prove Bill had personally threatened these witnesses, they argued he had ordered subordinates to do so, making him guilty under conspiracy laws. Bill was held on $100,000 bail. His father, Joe Bonanno, managed to pay the bail, and Bill was released pending trial. But the arrest marked a turning point. Bill now faced not just the threat of assassination from rival mobsters, but also federal prosecution. The government was coming for him with the full weight of its investigation. Bill Bonanno's first major federal trial began in 1968 in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The prosecution team was led by assistant U.S. attorneys who had spent years building expertise in organized crime cases. They presented their case methodically, beginning with FBI agents who testified about their surveillance of Bill during 1965 and 1966. Special agent after special agent took the stand, describing in detail how they had monitored Bill's activities, photographed him meeting with known criminals, and documented his movements during the Banana War. They presented surveillance logs showing Bill at locations and times that contradicted his claims of being a legitimate businessman, uninvolved in criminal activity. They played wiretapped phone conversations where Bill discussed family business using coded language. The prosecution then called cooperating witnesses, former Bonanno family associates who had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences on their own charges. These witnesses described the structure of the Bonanno family, explaining how the organization operated. They testified that Bill was his father's representative and effectively functioned as a boss during Joe Bonanno's disappearance. One cooperator described a meeting where Bill discussed strategies for dealing with the DeGregorio faction and protecting loyalists who were at risk of being killed. Another testified about gambling operations that Bill oversaw, describing how money was collected and distributed. Bill's defense team, led by criminal attorney Albert Krieger, argued that their client was being persecuted because of his father's reputation. They contended that Bill was a legitimate businessman who worked in his family's cheese distribution company and had nothing to do with organized crime. He knew people who were criminals. He had grown up around them, and they were family friends, but knowing criminals didn't make him one. The meetings that prosecutors said were mob business were actually social gatherings or legitimate business discussions about the cheese company. The wiretapped conversations were taken out of context and misinterpreted. They presented witnesses who testified that Bill was a devoted husband and father, a community member who attended church regularly, and a businessman trying to support his family. The trial lasted several weeks, with both sides presenting detailed evidence and calling numerous witnesses. After weeks of testimony, the prosecution argued that the evidence clearly showed Bill was a high-ranking member of a criminal organization who had conspired to obstruct justice. The defense argued that the government had failed to prove any specific criminal acts and was relying on guilt by association. The jury discussed it for several days. On November 5, 1968, Bill Bonanno's 36th birthday, they returned with their verdict. Bill was guilty on all counts of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Bill's conviction was a significant victory for federal prosecutors and a warning to other organized crime families that the government could successfully prosecute even the high-ranking members of the organization. On December 18, 1968, Bill Bonanno appeared before Judge Marvin Frankel for sentencing. Bill wasn't some low-level street criminal. He was the son of one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, positioned to take over a criminal empire, and he had used that position to obstruct justice and interfere with federal investigations. His actions had prevented witnesses from testifying, allowed criminals to escape prosecution, and started a cycle of violence and intimidation. The government argued that a significant amount of jail time was necessary, not just to punish Bill, but to send a message to other organized crime families that the federal government would not tolerate interference with its investigations. Judge Frankel sentenced Bill Bonanno to 4 years in federal prison to be served at a medium-security facility. The sentence was a significant amount of time, but not the maximum prosecutors had requested. The judge said that Bill had no prior federal convictions and that there was no evidence he had personally committed acts of violence, factors that led to a lighter sentence. Bill was placed in federal custody immediately and transported to begin serving his sentence. His appeals were denied, and he would serve around 3 years before being released on parole in 1971. The conviction and imprisonment marked the end of Bill's attempt to lead the Bonanno family and the destruction of his father's criminal empire. The Banana War had torn the family apart from within, weakened it to the point where other families no longer took it seriously. Bill Bonanno was eventually released from federal prison in 1971. His father, Joe Bonanno, had permanently retired to Arizona, ending his involvement in the crime family he had built. The commission had installed new leadership in the Bonanno family, and Bill was effectively sidelined from any meaningful role in organized crime. However, Bill's legal troubles were far from over. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, he faced additional arrests and convictions. In 1975, he was convicted of loan sharking and illegal gambling charges in California, resulting in another prison sentence. In 1982, he was convicted as part of a case targeting Bonanno family operations and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, the longest sentence he would receive. He served around 9 years before being released in 1991 at age 59. Bill Bonanno chose to write about his experiences. In 1999, he published his memoir, Bound by Honor, A Mafioso's Story, with journalist Gay Talese. The book provided an insider's perspective on La Cosa Nostra, discussing the Banana War, his relationship with his father, and the internal politics of the mob. Many in the remaining mafia community viewed his decision to publish a book as another form of betrayal. He spent his final years living quietly in California and Arizona, no longer a part of what remained of organized crime. He gave occasional interviews about mafia history and worked on a second book. On January 1, 2008, Salvatore Bill Bonanno died of a heart attack at his home in Tucson, Arizona. He was 75 years old. Bill Bonanno gave a lifetime of loyalty to a code that promised honor, but only delivered violence, betrayal, and a prison cell. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into organized crime history. while Bonanno inherited a reputation and lost it in a rain of bullets. This next man inherited a reputation and turned it into a billion-dollar scam. Section 3. Michael Franzese. In the history of organized crime, few stories are as compelling as that of Michael Franzese. Born on May 27, 1951, he was the son of Sonny Franzese, the underboss of the Colombo crime family, and one of the most feared and respected mafiosi of his era. Michael was groomed for greatness within the American mafia, but he defied the usual image of a mob enforcer. Charming, well-educated, and possessing a keen business mind, Franzese didn't rely solely on intimidation and violence. He became a master of financial crime, becoming the mastermind of what federal prosecutors would later call one of the most sophisticated gas tax rackets in American history, swindling the government out of an estimated $350 million in the 1980s, a sum equivalent to nearly $1 billion today. While other mob sons inherited their father's brutality, Franzese inherited his ambition and cunning, building an empire that was less about street-level extortion and more about corporate-level fraud. Unlike many of his peers in the Brooklyn neighborhoods, Michael wasn't made for the streets from day one. Sonny was adamant that Michael should pursue the American dream through legitimate means. Michael was a gifted athlete and a disciplined student, and growing up, Michael showed promise. He earned a scholarship to play football at Hofstra University and later attended medical school. The turning point in his life came when Sonny Franzese was convicted on bank robbery charges in 1967 and sentenced to 50 years in prison. With his father behind bars and the family's income and status at a low, Michael felt the legitimate path seemed slow and uncertain, while his father's world had promises of fast money, respect, and power. He began associating with his father's old crew, initially doing small favors and running minor errands. His intelligence and loyalty were quickly noted, and in 1975, at the age of 24, Michael was formally introduced into the Colombo family. His sponsor was none other than the acting boss, Carmine the Snake Persico. By the time Michael became part of the family, he had already shown a brilliance for white-collar crime that surpassed the old-school thuggery of those before him. He realized that the real money wasn't in small-time heists, but in complex scams. By his late 20s, Michael Franzese was one of the highest earners the mob had ever seen, earning him the nickname the Yuppie Don. Michael still had a relationship with his father, even when he was behind bars. Sonny, from his cell, was a man who had wanted better for his son. Yet his absence and legacy were the very things that pulled Michael into the life of crime. They communicated through visits, with Sonny offering advice and, at times, warnings. Michael was determined not just to be a soldier, but to restore and even exceed his family's former glory. He began building his own crew, but he was different from the old-school mobsters. He dressed in tailored suits, drove expensive cars, and was well-spoken. He saw the mafia not just as a criminal brotherhood, but as a business empire, and he was determined to be its most innovative and profitable executive. This mindset set him on a collision course with both the law and the traditionalists within his own family. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a period of aggressive expansion for Michael Franzese. He had no interest in the gritty, high-risk work of truck hijackings or street corner shakedowns. His focus was on high-yield, low-visibility financial schemes. He built a portfolio of seemingly legitimate businesses, car dealerships, film production companies, nightclubs, and gasoline distributorships, which served as both moneymakers and fronts for laundering illegal cash. Franzese was a charismatic figure, having the ability to easily create partnerships, often with legitimate businessmen who were either unaware of his true connections or willing to look the other way for a piece of the action. It was through one of these businesses that Franzese identified the opportunity for the score of a lifetime. In the gasoline industry, both federal and state governments collect a tax on every gallon of fuel sold. To steal this money, he created a series of fake companies that only existed on paper. These companies would pretend to buy and sell gasoline to each other. The tax bill would grow with each fake sale, but no one ever paid it. Finally, the last fake company in the chain, the one that officially owed the huge tax bill, would just disappear. The company would shut down or go bankrupt before the government could collect, and Francis and his crew would keep all the stolen tax money for themselves. The scheme was not initially Francis's idea. In 1981, he was approached by Lawrence "Larry" Iorizzo, a businessman who was already running a small-scale operation to defraud the government of gas taxes. Iorizzo was being threatened by other criminals and sought Francis's protection. Recognizing the immense potential of Iorizzo's method, Francis agreed to partner with him, providing the muscle and organizational structure of the Colombo crime family to scale the operation. The scheme required careful organization and compliant paperwork to avoid immediate detection, and the muscle of the mob to enforce silence and discipline among those who were involved. Francis was the architect of this scheme he called the Daisy Chain. He recruited accountants, lawyers, and bankers to give the operation a hint of legitimacy. He used threats and violence not as a first resort, but as a tool for enforcement when someone threatened to talk or took the profits for themselves. As the money poured in, millions every week, Francis's power and profile reached new heights. He became a celebrity mobster, featured in magazines, and even began investing in Hollywood movies. He had it all: immense wealth, fame, and power. But it was all built on a fraud so big, it was almost abstract. But this very success was building great pressure. The Internal Revenue Service and the Organized Crime Task Force began to notice the pattern of collapsing gasoline companies and tax losses. Furthermore, within the mafia, his flashy lifestyle and independent wealth creation created resentment among old guard bosses who distrusted his methods and took his earnings. Michael Francis's gas tax scheme was a masterclass in cheating the system. It wasn't a single heist, but a continuous, rolling theft operated like a Fortune 500 company. Francis established a headquarters in a modest office building on Long Island, from where he managed a network of over 100 shell corporations with names like Majestic Fuel and Crown Gasoline. Each had just enough paperwork and activity to appear legitimate. His operatives would identify a small, struggling gasoline wholesaler, offer to buy it, and then use its existing licenses to operate. Here's how a typical transaction worked. First, one of his fake companies would buy a truckload of gas from a real refinery. On paper, they claimed the gas was being exported to another state, so they didn't pay the tax. But that was a lie. Instead of leaving the state, the gas was sold to another fake company that Francis owned, right inside the same state. That second company would then sell it to a third fake company, and so on. Every time the gas was sold to a new fake company, the government was owed a tax of about 15 cents per gallon. But none of these companies ever sent that money to the government. They just kept it. Finally, the last fake company in line would sell the gas to real gas stations and owe a huge tax bill, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for just one truckload. Then that last company would simply disappear, shutting down before the government could collect. By the time tax agents tracked down the company's empty office, all the stolen tax money was already gone, hidden in secret bank accounts or cleaned through other businesses. At its peak, Francis's operation was stealing an estimated $8 to $10 million per week. He didn't just hoard the cash, he reinvested it to further build his empire. He eventually became a famous figure on the Hollywood party scene. He owned a fleet of luxury cars, multi-million-dollar homes, and wore custom-made suits. The crime was largely bloodless on the surface. No gangland shootings, no bodies in trunks. But it was economically violent. The stolen tax dollars meant less money for public roads, infrastructure, and services. It also created an illegitimate market that drove honest gasoline dealers out of business. When necessary, Francis's organization employed traditional mob tactics. Drivers or accountants who talked too much were threatened. Business partners who tried to cheat were beaten. The threat of his Colombo family backing was always present, ensuring cooperation and silence. Francis wasn't just stealing money. He was corrupting an entire sector of the economy, proving that in the modern era, a pen, a filing cabinet, and a ruthless mind could be more powerful than a gun. Franzesi's scheme would eventually get discovered, not with a dramatic raid, but with the quiet, persistent work of forensic accountants and a dedicated organized crime strike force. The first red flag was a pattern of bankruptcies in the New York and New Jersey gasoline industry in the early 1980s. State tax authorities noticed that an unusual number of small fuel wholesalers were going under, each leaving behind staggering unpaid tax bills. When investigators dug deeper, they found common links, shared addresses, connected phone numbers, and overlapping officers, all being classic signs of a coordinated scam. The investigation was headed by the FBI's Long Island office and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. It was a new kind of mob case. Instead of relying on wiretaps about murders or gambling, agents spent countless hours tracing corporate paperwork, bank transactions, and fuel shipment manifests. They began to map the daisy chain, following the complex path of ghost gasoline sales. The breakthrough came when they managed to turn a key insider, an accountant within Franzesi's operation who was facing his own legal troubles and agreed to cooperate. Lawrence Iarizzo was the witness who provided everything, explaining the complex structure and naming Michael Franzese as the mastermind. With this information, investigators obtained court-authorized wiretaps on Franzesi's phones and those of his key lieutenants. They also started physical surveillance, tracking his movements between his offices, homes, and social clubs. The evidence they gathered was damning. Recorded conversations captured Franzese discussing the creation of new shell companies, directing the movement of millions of dollars, and issuing coded threats to associates. One recording caught him explaining the core philosophy of the scam. "We're not in the gasoline business, we're in the tax business." Simultaneously, the mob itself was becoming a threat. Franzese's sudden success and independence had angered powerful figures in the Colombo family, particularly the imprisoned boss, Carmine Persico. Persico suspected Franzese was not giving up a large enough share of his profits to the family treasury. There were rumors of a contract on Franzese's life. This internal pressure created a second front of danger for him, making him vulnerable. In 1985, facing the overwhelming financial evidence compiled by the FBI and IRS, and aware of the mortal threat from his own organization, Michael Franzese was presented with a choice by federal prosecutors: face an indictment that could put him away for 100 years, or cooperate. In a move that sent shockwaves through the mafia underworld, Michael Franzese chose to fight. In 1986, he was indicted under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act, facing 14 counts related to the gas tax scheme, loan sharking, and racketeering. The trial was a media spectacle, dubbed the Mafia MBA case. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Laura Ward, built its case on the mountain of documentary evidence. Thousands of pages of bank records, corporate filings, and fuel logs that traced the fraud. The star witness was the turned accountant, who walked the jury through the complex structure and mechanics of the daisy chain, using charts and diagrams to illustrate the $350 million theft. Franzese's defense team, led by famed attorney Bruce Cutler, did not argue the existence of the scheme. Instead, they attacked the prosecution's narrative of Franzese as the undisputed kingpin. They argued that he was merely a businessman who had gotten involved with the wrong partners, that the gas tax fraud was something started by others, and that the government was making his role appear more important than it actually was because of his famous last name. Cutler painted the cooperating witnesses as liars who were trading testimony for reduced sentences. He highlighted Franzese's legitimate business ventures in film and automobiles, attempting to portray him as an entrepreneur who had strayed, not a lifelong gangster. The trial lasted for months. The most dramatic moments came during Franzese's own testimony. Calm, articulate, and dressed perfectly, he admitted to knowing people in the mafia, but denied being made a member or giving orders. He acknowledged being in the gasoline business, but claimed ignorance of the tax fraud, blaming it on rogue crew members. His performance was persuasive to some observers, but the weight of the evidence was crushing. Phone records placed him at the center of the operation, and multiple legal documents had his fingerprints. In the end, the jury was convinced by the paper trail, not the personality. After discussing for a week, they found Michael Francesi guilty on 10 of the 14 counts, including racketeering conspiracy. The conviction was a victory for prosecutors, proving that complex financial crimes could be successfully tried under the RICO Act. For the mafia, it was a sign that their new generation of educated, white-collar leaders was just as vulnerable to prosecution as the old thugs. Francesi was immediately placed into custody to await sentencing, his empire officially torn apart by the verdict. During the sentencing hearing in 1986, the prosecution argued for a maximum sentence, emphasizing the breathtaking scale of the theft, one of the largest tax frauds in U.S. history at the time. Prosecutors stated that Francesi's crimes were not victimless. They stole from every taxpayer and damaged the integrity of the economy. They presented statements from state tax commissioners detailing budget shortfalls, and from legitimate gasoline dealers who described being driven into bankruptcy because they couldn't compete with Francesi's tax-free illegal fuel. New York State Tax Commissioner James Tully testified that the gas tax scheme had cost the state an estimated $1 billion in lost revenue over a 5-year period, when accounting for all similar operations Francesi had inspired. He explained that this money should have funded road repairs, bridge maintenance, and public transportation improvements that never happened. Schools in districts across New York and New Jersey faced budget cuts because the anticipated tax revenue simply never arrived. Tully showed photographs of crumbling infrastructure, potholes that couldn't be filled, bridges that couldn't be repaired, school programs that had to be canceled, all because the money that should have paid for them had been stolen. Several legitimate gasoline distributors gave emotional testimony about how Francesi's operation had destroyed their livelihoods. Robert Mancini, who had operated a family gasoline business in Queens for 30 years, described how his company went bankrupt in 1984 after gas stations stopped buying from him. They could get fuel from Francesi's network for 15 cents per gallon cheaper, because Francesi wasn't paying taxes. Mancini's business had been seized by creditors. His employees lost their jobs. His retirement savings were gone. 3 other former gasoline distributors gave similar testimony, representing dozens of legitimate businesses that had been driven under by Francesi's illegal operations. The defense pleaded for leniency, highlighting Francesi's lack of a violent criminal record, his family ties, and his potential for rehabilitation. They presented him as a charismatic, intelligent man who had made terrible choices but was not inherently violent. Judge Jack B. Weinstein, known for his thoughtful and compassionate sentences, considered the arguments carefully. He acknowledged the sophistication and magnitude of the crime, noting that Francesi had operated a virtual corporation of crime. Judge Weinstein sentenced Michael Francesi to 10 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay a compensation of $15 million, which was only a fraction of the total theft, but already a huge sum at the time. The sentence was seen as surprisingly lenient by some, given the potential for decades behind bars under RICO. However, Weinstein noted that unlike many mob defendants, Francesi had been convicted primarily of financial crimes, not violence. The judge also pointed to Francesi's decision not to cooperate, which meant he had not earned the greater sentence reduction that comes with testifying against others. The message was clear. The law could dismantle a financial empire as effectively as it could a violent crew. Francesi was sent to the federal penitentiary at Terre Haute, Indiana, to begin his term. Michael Francesi served 8 years of his 10-year sentence, being released in 1994. His release, however, was not a return to his old life. While in prison, he had undergone a deeply personal transformation, heavily influenced by his wife Camille, and a rediscovery of his Christian faith. In a final break that astonished law enforcement and the mob alike, he publicly said that he had no intention of ever returning to organized crime. He did not become a traditional informant, but he refused to return to the Colombo family, a move that in the past would have been a death sentence. Miraculously, he survived. Since his release, Franzese has crafted a second act as one of the most famous former mobsters in America. He is a best-selling author, having written books like Quitting the Mob and Blood Covenant. He is a highly sought-after motivational speaker, traveling the world to corporations, universities, and churches, delivering a powerful message about the dangers of greed, the importance of integrity, and the possibility of redemption. He has participated in documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube interviews, analyzing mob culture with the insight of an insider. His story is a staple of true crime media. Now in his 70s, Franzese lives a quiet, legitimate life. He has had no further legal troubles. His relationship with his father remained until Sonny's death in 2020 at the age of 103. Sonny never publicly criticized his son's decision to leave organized crime, but the distance between their chosen paths was great. Michael Franzese is now remembered for two completely different things. He is remembered in law enforcement circles as the architect of a legendary fraud, a case study in modern racketeering. But to the public, he is perhaps the most successful, redeemed mob boss in history. A man who walked away from absolute power and wealth within the mafia, survived, and built a new life, preaching against the very world that made him famous. Against all odds, Michael Franzese has spent the last 3 decades from king of crime to an advocate against the kind of life he once led. If you enjoyed this deep dive into most ruthless mob boss sons, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.